Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Tune in next week when we'll be joined by Nancy K. Bristow, who will discuss her new book on the 1970 Jackson State shootings. Today, we are delighted to welcome Larry Wells, who will present In Faulkner's Shadow. Larry was married to Dean Faulkner Wells, with whom he co-founded the Yoknapatawpha Press. Larry Wells earned his BA and MA degrees from the University of Alabama and his PhD from the University of Mississippi. He is the author of the novels Rommel and the Rebel, Let the Band Play Dixie, and Rommel's Peace, as well as the Emmy-winning Mississippi Public Television documentary Return to the River. In Faulkner's Shadow is the title of Wells' new memoir, published by the University Press of Mississippi. Here's Larry Wells.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to start off with an overview of In Faulkner's Shadow, and then I'm going to read several chapters. In Faulkner's Shadow is an autobiography based on my marriage into a Southern literary family whose identity was shaped by its most famous member, William Faulkner. The day we met, my future wife, Dean Faulkner Wells, niece of William Faulkner, phoned a childhood friend and said, "I've just met the man I want to spend the rest of my life with." The friend confided this to me after Dean died. I had no idea that for Dean it was love at first sight. She never told me. When Dean and I were trying to decide whether to get married, we experienced what can only be called a visitation from Pappy, as she called her uncle, William Faulkner. Sensing a presence, I woke up in my student apartment to see Faulkner's face at my window. Across town, in her home, Dean was awakened at that moment by the smell of Dunhill pipe smoke, the brand her uncle smoked. Later, on 2 occasions at Dean's home, I smelled the pipe smoke too. The question was whether Pappy had appeared to bless us or warn us. We were married October 6, 1972. After being accepted as a stepfather by Dean's 3 children, I set about to find my place in the Faulkner family. In William's absence, Dean's 3 first cousins, Jill, Jimmy, and Chookie, and her step-cousin, Vicky, each struggled to live under Pappy's shadow. I soon learned that in Dean's generation, sibling rivalries begun in childhood lasted into adulthood. I never met Mr. Faulkner, but was a pallbearer at the funerals of his wife Estelle, his brother Jack, and his stepson Malcolm. After William's death, the town of Oxford treated the Faulkner family like royalty. Dean wanted to be regarded as an individual and nothing more, but she was expected to carry on a literary tradition. Holding on to her identity was not easy, nor was it for her cousins, who each dealt with the challenge in different ways. The town of Oxford had to make its own adjustments to life after Faulkner. Dean and I participated in Oxford's emergence as a thriving and productive literary community. Our independent publishing company, Yoknapatawpha Press, was part of this rival, as was Square Books, the jewel of an independent bookstore founded in 1977 by booksellers Richard and Lisa Howarth. When Willie Morris and Barry Hannah were hired by the University of Mississippi in 1980 and 81, respectively, the literary renaissance was in full swing. With Dean as soul sister, den mother, and peacemaker, Morris and Hannah took Oxford by storm. Morris was the first to be hired. The Ole Miss school budget had no funds for a writer in residence, and through personal and corporate donations, Dean and I helped raise funding for Morris's first-year salary. In the fall of 1980, Yoknapatawpha Press reissued Morris's children's book, Good Old Boy, A Delta Boyhood, which was then out of print. And in 1981, we followed it with an essay collection entitled Terrains of the Heart. In 1983, we reissued North or Home, Willie's magnum opus, and kept it in print for 16 years. Oxford as a community had waited long and patiently to show its appreciation for a writer, In the 20s and 30s, William Faulkner steadfastly refused to accept the town's admiration or to forgive those who once called him Count No Count and the Corncob Man. This dammed-up reservoir of affection burst onto Willie Morris, then spilled over onto Barry Hannah. With these rivals in residence at Ole Miss, Oxford enjoyed a literary boom that included authors Richard Ford and John Grisham, Larry Brown, Ace Atkins, Tom Franklin, and Beth Ann Finley, to name a few, would follow. When we met Hannah in 1980, instead of saying, "Nice to meet you," or "How are you?" his first words to me were, "I could overpower you and take your woman." Before I could reply, Dean said, "You'll have to fight both of us." From then on, Hannah worshiped Dean, dubbing her that scrappy Faulkner woman. And for the next decade, Morris and Hannah would vie for Dean's approval with often hilarious results. In 1982, Morris experienced a slump and needed a book idea. Author David Halberstam visited Oxford and told him about a high school running back in Philadelphia, Mississippi named Marcus Dupree, and how college coaches were engaged in a secret bidding war. Morris jumped on the suggestion. I shipped Sterling Lord, Willie's agent and mine later, 10 copies of the Yoknapatawpha Press edition of North Ord Home to distribute with a book proposal. Doubleday bought the book, and they bought it with a 2-page outline and a promise to deliver. 2-page outline. $100,000 advance, I'll tell that. I'll give you that secret. I drove Willie to see Dupree play football on several occasions. Willie asked me to suggest a name for his undercover source, an Ole Miss football coach, now deceased. Deep Throat was taken, he said. I came up with the pseudonym Temple Drake, Faulkner's lead character in Sanctuary. At age 50, I began searching for the Larry Wells that I had been the previous 49 years. The graduate student whom Dean wanted to spend the rest of her life with, writer, editor, bass player, and obsessive-compulsive. I had published 2 novels with Doubleday in the 1980s, scripted a Emmy-winning documentary, and had 4 screenplays optioned in L.A., but most of my time was given to publishing other writers. Part of me, the most natural part, was being swallowed by the Faulkner mystique. I rebelled against being identified primarily as a Faulkner-in-law. On a different level, what had happened to Dean was happening to me. There were times when acquaintances unintentionally even called me Dean. "Hey, Dean, how are you?" Dean had lived all her life with this identity problem, rebelling against being stereotyped as Faulkner's niece. Jimmy Buffett's mother, Pete's, who was one of Dean's closest friends, helped her accept her role. Pete's motto was, "You can't escape who you are, so sit back and enjoy the ride." At 73, Dean was diagnosed with COPD, a progressive disease with no cure. As we were leaving the doctor's office, she said, "Now I have to write the damn book." And that just shows you Dean's, not only her courage and her sense of assurance and purpose, but her sense of humor. She was incredible. Using the 2 years of life remaining to her, she wrote, and I typed, her memoir, Every Day by the Sun, which was published by Crown Publishing Group, which was a division of Random House. In the process, Dean discovered an essential truth about herself. Though she had been many things to many people, she was universally loved, not as an accessory to her uncle's achievements, but for who she was and what she gave to her friends and family. I don't know which I fell in love with first, Dean or her story. To me, both were inseparable. Before we met, I knew that her father had been killed in a plane crash and that her uncle, the American Shakespeare, had adopted and reared her. What I learned by being around her was that she was equipped genetically, intellectually, and psychologically to flourish in a literary environment. Like her father, Dean Swift Faulkner, youngest brother of William, she lived every day by the sun and could light up a room simply by being there. The day we met at a graduate seminar, her first question was, "What is a participle?" We were teaching assistants at the University of Mississippi, and lacking classroom experience, she came to me for advice. Having taught college English for 6 years, I became her office mate and freshman composition counselor. We took graduate courses together, formed a study group, swapped notes and class lectures, and partied with our classmates. That was 1970 at Ole Miss, and we had a sort of a fledgling graduate program going. And I think we were all glad to be there. And one of the teachers sent around a memo saying, "There's too much jocularity on the second floor of Bondurant Hall." We weren't wild, but we knew when we'd have a good time. What did she see in me that day in Lewis Dollarhyde's seminar when she glanced across the round table in Bishop Hall? She said I reminded her of Pappy. Maybe I resemble Faulkner as she remembered him from childhood. I've always been a storyteller, and she had grown up on his stories. The standard explanation she gave over the years was, "You made me smile." How did it feel to be married to Dean? For a long time I thought fate brought us together. Everybody likes to think that, I guess. I was the romantic, she was the realist, and not inclined to analyze how or why we happened. Still, like all couples, we talked about our courtship in bits and pieces. I wanted to parse the miracle. She wanted to enjoy it. As far as she was concerned, the past was fine the way it was and best left alone. Even though this went against her uncle's maxim, the past is never dead, it's not even past. To her, we were a convergence of the twain. We randomly crossed paths and joined forces. End of discussion. Dean was all about truth. To be married to her was to lie in the dark and watch the footage unwind. She didn't volunteer stories about growing up. Facts emerged at their own seasonal pace. One day, walking our dog at Roanoke, a memory occurred to her. Every summer, Pappy set up a croquet course which remained in place until the first frost. One day, as they were playing a competitive match, cutthroat croquet they called it, William, his daughter Jill, 12, his niece Dean, 9, and step-granddaughter Vicky, 8. A powerful thunderstorm blew up quite suddenly. The trees bent under the wind and the sky turned black. Glancing at each other, the girls exchanged an unspoken vow. None of the three would run until Pappy did. Even after the first lightning strike, he kept playing as the thunder rolled, and instinctively, at the same moment, they understood life was a game to be played to the end. In those few minutes of exposure to mortal danger, lightning striking around Roanoke, an overwhelming rivalry was born among the three girls, shaping them to their core. It is no exaggeration to say that in that life-altering moment, as they stood waiting to see who would be the first to run, Pappy's girls were struck by his lightning. What happened in that storm forged Dean's personality. Knowing this helped me understand why we came together. Okay, here's chapter 1. What is a participle? We met at the University of Mississippi in a Beowulf seminar. Professor Lewis Dollarhyde began to lecture as he entered the classroom. The compound berserk, he said, meant bear of one zark, the ringmail shirt that Vikings wore into battle. The fiercest of the Danes would rip off his protective armor and race bear zark into battle. This often proved fatal, Dollarhyde added. I risked a glance at the young woman who sat across the table from me. Word was out that Faulkner's niece had enrolled in graduate school. A fellow student pointed her out to me before class. She was named for her father, Dean Swift Faulkner, a professional pilot killed in a plane crash in the biplane his brother William had given him. Her uncle William, or Pappy as she knew him, became her legal guardian and paid for her schooling. In Mississippi, being kin to William Faulkner is like being related to the Pope in Rome. That's how we related to Dean. She was part of the first family of Mississippi. Instead of taking notes, Dean seemed to listen for a clash of Viking swords. Her head slightly tilted her dark hair framing her face. Prior to enrolling at the University of Mississippi, I taught English for 4 years at Murray State University in Kentucky. When an Ole Miss professor came to Murray on a recruiting trip, he convinced me to apply to Ole Miss's fledgling PhD program in English. On my first visit to Oxford, I drove down North Lamar Boulevard, saw the courthouse framed by oaks, and knew I'd come to the right place. Oxford in 1970 was a small college town of 10,000 permanent residents. The university's 8,000 students lived mostly on campus and avoid establishments frequented by adults, and unlike today when we have 20 bars on the square. 8 years after James Meredith enrolled at Ole Miss, the integration of the university was very much a work in progress. That fall, the Ole Miss football team would field its first African-American player, Ben Williams, a freshman nose tackle from Yazoo City. Vietnam vets of every race and religion walked to class sporting fatigue jackets and shoulder-length hair. Ole Miss was flower child territory. There were rock concerts in the Grove, the wooded tailgating area at the center of the campus, and clouds of marijuana smoke. I promise you I was there, I know. I wasn't smoking, though. University police sporting long sideburns looked the other way. Woodstock had come to Mississippi. I lived across the street from Mac Reed, co-owner of Gathright Reed Pharmacy, who had been a friend of William Faulkner. Mac and his wife often invited me over for coffee. He reminisced about packing Faulkner's manuscripts in the 1940s and mailing them off to publishers. But the author's portrayal of slavery and Reconstruction did not set well with some white Mississippians, many of whom denigrated the writer and disparaged his work sight unseen. I soon blundered into the prejudice which had plagued Oxford's most famous native all his life. When my ancient Royal Standard typewriter broke down, I took it to Varner's repair shop on the square. Mr. Varner had lost his arm in an accident, yet could fix anything with one hand. He examined my broken typewriter and began writing up a ticket. I couldn't resist remarking that Faulkner had used the name Varner in the Hamlet, and that in the novel, Will Varner owned the general store in Frenchman's Bend. The repairman didn't look up. Curious and hoping for a reaction, I added, Faulkner made Will Varner the richest man in the county. Quote, if that Faulkner fellow was still around, Varner muttered, I wouldn't cross the street to speak to him. And space break. That first meeting for the Beowulf seminar had been over for an hour when I ran into Dean in the corridor. What's a participle? Her first words to me could have come from those fabled matchmakers strunk in white. We were standing in the lobby of Bondurant Hall. Classes were changing, students filling the hallway. She was 5'4", tiny-waisted and slender. Let me guess, I said, a student asked you to define participle. She nodded. It's been an ice age since I thought about grammar and usage. Most people raised their voices to be heard. Dean whispered and listeners leaned in. I leaned in. Excuse me? Please, if you don't mind, what is a participle? The ing form of a verb is in running. Of course, how stupid of me. She stuck out her hand to introduce herself. I'm Dean Mallard, she said, using her married name. An hour before classes started, she went on, the chairman of the English department assigned me a freshman class to teach. I didn't have time to prepare, and I've never taught anything except swimming lessons. On impulse, I asked if you'd like a cup of coffee, and to my astonishment, she accepted. I noticed you in Old English class, she told me as we sat over coffee. You have blue eyes, she said. I've always wanted blue eyes. All of my family have them except for me, Nanny, and 2 uncles. I thought of William Faulkner's dark eyes peering out of a famous Cofield photograph. So that's what she had seen in me. Every man should be so lucky as to have blue eyes. That first meeting began our friendship. Before long, we joined a graduate study group and were sharing lecture notes and cramming for exams. I loaned her my lectures on freshman composition and vowed to let no other teaching assistant come between us. She was a quick learner. She would instill confidence and teach skills to hundreds of composition students. Eventually, law students audited her class. Dean bore a stunning resemblance to her uncle. They both had dark hair, brown eyes, and a deliberate manner. She was soft-spoken, yet with an air of that total assurance common to all Faulkners. Faces brightened when she entered a room. People felt that they were in William's presence. When William Faulkner's mistresses, Meta Carpenter Wild, Jean Stein, and Joan Williams, met Dean on separate occasions, and I was there, each burst into tears and gripped her hands as if seeking a familiar warmth. She reminded them of her uncle. Perhaps they even saw in her the child they might have had with Bill. She did not judge them. That they made her uncle happy was all that mattered. Dean has a chapter on this, William Faulkner and the women that he loved. And she's very frank and candid about this. So I urge you to read her book, Every Day by the Sun. In a lot of ways, this book is a sequel to that. Dean's books ended in 1962 with William's death, and mine started in 1970 when we met. We began the eternal process of getting to know each other's past. One night at the kitchen table, I asked what it was like to grow up at Roanoke. She didn't like being asked. It was as if her memories were too dear to part with. Every Halloween, she replied, reluctant and protective. Pappy would light a candle and tell ghost stories. He made up a poltergeist named Judith, the daughter of Colonel Shegog, original owner of Roanoke, who, according to Pappy, committed suicide by jumping off the balcony. Judith, not her father. We never tired of hearing the story. Pappy would tell the bravest among us to carry the candle to Judith's grave. Remember, this is Dean talking. Holding our breath, we walked on tiptoe to the magnolia under which Judith was allegedly buried. When the flame went out, as it always did, we looked to Pappy for reassurance. Of course, he had slipped away and in the dark and was nowhere to be seen. That was his little practical joke. What did you do then? I said. Ran like hell, every man for himself. Her grandmother Maud was an immovable object in Dean's life. Maud called her lamb, told her bedtime stories, painted bucolic scenes on the bottom of her milk glass with oil paint. To see the picture, she had to finish her milk. Yet, as with most of her Faulkner relatives, Dean came to love Nanny not because of, but in spite of. Not because of her virtues, but in spite of her faults. Miss Maud was a Spartan personality with a tendency to hold a grudge. She was proud of William's writings and defended him against his critics. One day I noticed stacks of old-time magazines in the attic. When I asked Dean, she smiled and said, Nanny loved Time and kept her old issues, but when the magazine published an article about Pappy getting off the plane drunk, she canceled her subscription. Maud was overly protective of her son, even when her friends were concerned. When Faulkner's sensationalistic novel Sanctuary was published in 1931, he was quoted as saying it was deliberately conceived to make money. Maud's friends were more than eager to know if Faulkner had based the character Temple Drake on a certain judge's daughter, who lived very close to Maud, by the way, an Ole Miss co-ed and a flapper in the Roaring Twenties. At a game of bridge one afternoon, one of the ladies summoned the nerve to ask, Maud, why did Billy write that book? Miss Maud lowered her cards and said, My Billy writes what he has to. I'm going to repeat that. My Billy writes what he has to. She replied, biting off each word. She finished playing the rubber, and according to Dean, who had heard the account from eyewitnesses, canceled her membership in the bridge club. She's good at canceling things. Like her outgoing father, Dean took life one day at a time and enjoyed the good times. As an undergraduate at Ole Miss, she played tennis and swam freestyle on the intramural teams. She inherited her father's love of sports and William's love of the written word. At age 13, she devoured Faulkner's novel, Intruder in the Dust, the night before attending the 1949 movie premiere. She had put off reading it for some reason, but she read it that night, stayed up late reading the book. Can you believe that? At Roanoke. In Oxford Lyric Theater, she stood for the first time in the glare of celebrity with William, his wife Estelle, their daughter Jill, and her step-cousin Vicky. But it was 7 years later that she became aware of her uncle's influence and reach. At 20, she was sailing to France to study abroad. William, who was paying for it, flew to New York to see her off. The night before she was to sail, he and Random House editor Sax Cummins took Dean to dinner. She noticed heads turning as they walked down Park Avenue to her uncle's favorite restaurant. She was certain people were staring at her in her black cotton sheath dress, her hair cut like her idol, Françoise Sagan. But they were all staring at her uncle. That was the time she realized just how famous Pappy really was. This wasn't Oxford, Mississippi, where everyone knew his name, but New York, with strangers infatuated and gawking. My own introduction to her uncle's work came rather late for an English major. I put off reading Faulkner until I was a senior at the University of Alabama. I confess, mea culpa. I picked up a copy of the portable Faulkner, which contained editor Malcolm Cowley's explication of the Yoknapatawpha saga. When the book first appeared in 1946, most of William Faulkner's books were out of print. Due in part to Cowley's masterful interpretation, Faulkner's achievement became more widely appreciated, and he was awarded the 1949 Nobel Prize in Literature. At first glance, I knew Faulkner's characters. Every town has a Flem Snopes. In Ozark, Alabama, where I grew up, I remembered a wealthy loner whose hobby was collecting Coke bottles for the deposits. In the doomed Sartorises, I saw my Wells grandfather, vice president of a bank that failed during the Depression. The McCaslins were close kin to the McGees, my mother's Scotch-Irish clan, gregarious and proud. My only problem with Faulkner was how to pronounce Yoknapatawpha, the Chickasaw word which could be interpreted as slow water or the people of the gentle water. That's the Yokne River today. This word was Faulkner's curse on the reading public. It was like talking with a mouthful of marbles. Yoknapatawpha, but Eudora Welty said, "I'm a Yoknapatawpha fanatic." As Dean, God bless her. As Dean and I melded our lives and families together and I settled down permanently in Oxford, how could I have imagined that 10 years later I'd meet Malcolm Cowley at the inaugural Faulkner Conference at the University of Mississippi, or that I would operate an indie press, which its first owner named Yoknapatawpha Press. Together, Dean and I would publish books by William Faulkner, Willie Morris, James Autry, Elise Winter, and Edwin Yoder, Jr. We would publish the Faulkner Newsletter and Yoknapatawpha Review, establish the Faux Faulkner Parody Contest, and stage judging parties at Elaine's restaurant in New York. It was a damn good thing I learned to pronounce Yoknapatawpha. Chapter 3, Chocho and Vicky. It was inevitable that I'd begin meeting members of Dean's family, even those who were not her blood kin. When William Faulkner married his first and only wife, Estelle Oldham, she came with a daughter, Victoria, and son, Malcolm, from her previous marriage. Faulkner's young stepdaughter, Victoria, spent her childhood in Shanghai. Her nurse nicknamed her Chocho, which is Mandarin for butterfly. In 1971, a year before Dean and I were married, the phone rang. It was Chocho's daughter, Vicky, calling from JFK Airport to let Dean know that she and her mother would be landing in Memphis Airport in a few hours, and they needed a ride to Oxford. Vicky's husband, a Venezuelan named Jim Black, had died, and they were bringing him to Oxford for burial. Dean hadn't heard from Chocho or Vicky in several years until they needed a ride from Memphis. Dean tried to dissuade me from accompanying her. Memphis is an hour northwest, or hour and a half northwest of Oxford. At first, I assumed she didn't want to impose, but she had a better reason. "They're my bucket of worms," she said. "Nobody has relatives as interesting as yours," I said. William Faulkner had died in 1962, and by 1971, negotiations were underway for Jill Faulkner Summers, his daughter, to sell Roanoke to the University of Mississippi. Until then, she allowed family members to stay for short visits. Dr. James Webb, chair of the Ole Miss English department and curator of Roanoke, had left the driveway gate unlocked for us. Still in place was the private keep out sign that William Faulkner himself had installed. I parked under the porte-cochere designed for horses and carriages. I was interested in seeing how Estelle's daughter and granddaughter would react to being back at the homestead, with the white columns, gallery, and cedars hold powerful memories. Careful with my bags, Chocho said. The one on the left is Gucci. Dean unlocked the house. The air. Now think about this. The house has been closed up for a long time. I'm smelling the same air Faulkner smelled, basically. The air was stale and warm. You could smell the odors of food that had been cooked over the years. It was incredible. Dean asked me to open the windows because one day, the day after Mr. Bill's funeral, Estelle had famously installed the first air conditioner in her upstairs bedroom, the window unit. A true 19th century man, William Faulkner, had rejected this modern appliance. Chocho was to sleep in her mother's air-conditioned room. The rest of the family had to make do with rotating fans. The women's casual conversation filled the house with an ease of belonging. You had to be born with that. You had to live at Roanoke to have that, and I could feel it. I sensed Dean's delight in stirring up memories. Louise arrived with Dean's children. After greeting Vicki and Chocho, the kids took Vicki's daughter Jillian by the hand and raced upstairs to explore, laughter trailing behind them, their footfalls racing across the decades. In an instant, Roanoke was restored to what it had once been, a family home. It takes children. And Dean and Jill and Vicki were Faulkner's girls. They were his children in that house. Chocho asked me to build a fire. Pappy always kept a fire going, she said. I didn't point out that the temperature was in the 80s. I scavenged the grounds for firewood while Chocho and Vicki, highballs in hand, watched from the gallery. It sounds like I was their slave. I carried an armload of sticks and branches into the library. What to use for tinder? In an upstairs bathroom, I found a magazine and tore out pages. And I promise you, I used the Harper's Bazaar, not the Field and Stream, which still had William Faulkner's name printed on it. Later, I would be scolded by the curator for destroying a literary artifact. Soon, the cedar branches were blazing. Chocho rattled ice in her glass. I went to get refills. When I returned with the drinks, Dean had begun reciting one of her uncle's favorite limericks. Vicki joined in. And this is what they quoted, so don't blame me. There once was a young man from Sparta, a really magnificent farter. Just by eating a bean, he'd fart God Save the Queen and Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The children howled in amusement as if to say, look what adults do for fun. Dean and Vicki hurled rhymes back and forth, evoking days gone by. This was Jim Black's Wake. And the limericks were Dean's way of evoking the past and helping Vicki cope. But they soon were subconsciously competing for the absent Pappy's approval, exulting in his imagined chuckles as if the limericks had started with him and were trickling down. The impromptu recitation, I realized, was less about remembering rhymes than celebrating the Roanoke they had all known. With joyful limericks, Pappy's girls all but lured him into the firelight. They plowed through doggerel until memory played out. Cedar branches popped and crackled in the fireplace. Shall we go out on the gallery, Chocho said. I didn't want to leave. Something told me this was the only time I would experience the Roanoke they had known when Faulkner was alive. Here were three powerful personalities, four if one counted Dean's mother, Louise, shaped and scarred by Faulkner's fire. This complex and haunted homecoming was my induction into the Faulkner family. For a few hours, I experienced the Roanoke that Dean had known, warm, enchanting, and eccentric. We finally said our goodbyes. As Dean and I walked to the car, she stopped, and standing under the cedars, she said, I wish I could have given you to Pappy. He'd have made you his right-hand man, and you would have been the best of friends. Okay, I have to read you a little bit about Willie Morris. I can't come to Jackson, Mississippi and not talk about Willie. I first met Willie Morris, former editor of Harper's Magazine, in 1978 when he was thinking of leaving Bridgehampton, New York, and moving back to Mississippi. In 1980, he became the first writer in residence at the University of Mississippi and helped establish a new post-Faulkner era in Oxford. In the fall of 1981, Morris joined the journalism faculty at the University of Mississippi and taught a feature writing class in which student essays were published in a biannual tabloid journal he called Ole Miss Magazine. For admission to his class, Morris interviewed the prospective students. He wanted only the top tier. When the semester began, he taught the class the same way he had held editorial meetings at Harper's, setting up the various departments and discussing ideas for stories. He assigned the students essays by David Halberstam, Larry L. King, John Corey, and Marshall Frady, whom he had published in Harper's. When they were ready to hit the streets and gather material, he let them choose their assignments and sometimes accompanied them on fact-finding missions. At the Jitney Jungle, he pointed out shoppers stopping in the aisles, talking and laughing, and fellow shoppers didn't get irritated. They struck up secondary conversations and waited. Standing in the aisle, soaking up the atmosphere, Morris jotted down a title, Litany at the Jitney. Always start with a title, he told his student essayists, who today look back on Morris's class as a pivotal influence. Willie couldn't resist contributing to the debut issue of the Ole Miss Magazine. He wrote, Eulogy to Billy Goat Hill, a grassy knoll behind center field in the baseball stadium at the University of Texas, his alma mater. Quote, I took the same route of my college days when I drove the long stretch from my Mississippi Delta town to Austin in a vintage black and white Plymouth with dual exhausts. Distant expanses of fields where the courthouses, lazy intersections I once knew, greet me now in the most haphazard deja vu. Carthage, Palestine, Buffalo, Franklin, Hearn, Rockdale, Thrall. Have they existed in a dreamy hush all these years and awakened now just for me? Morris sent Department Chair Will Norton a list of editors and writers to receive complimentary copies of the Ole Miss Magazine. The magazine writing and publishing class provided an opportunity for Morris to teach by example. From the choice of assignments to his legendary hands-on editing, he passed on invaluable lessons. One night after last call at the Holiday Inn bar, where Morris had convened class, Cokes only for the students, a scholarly ale or two for the teacher. He asked me to follow him to 16 Faculty Row. He was eager to show me a mock-up of the first issue of Ole Miss Magazine. Flattered and curious, I followed him home. We'd barely sat down when he snatched up a felt-tip pen and started editing. As long as Willie Morris was upright, alert, and protected from the elements, he could have edited anywhere, anytime. I watched him transform raw prose into finished product by deleting a word, adding a modifying phrase, pausing now and then to sip bourbon-flavored coffee, weighing the results on his jeweler's scale. Editing to him was like breathing, and for a brief time, 2 semesters perhaps, the Ole Miss Magazine gave him a feeling of being in the saddle. And by the way, it was a great magazine, might have been the best in America at that time. Editing for publication with none of the pressures of New York, he flicked away this digression and that cliche, entered the writer's thought process, and reshaped the narrative without altering style or voice. I was being made privy to the sure instincts of a professional editor. Looking over his shoulder as he worked, blinking away the cigarette smoke, I knew very well this was my editing tutorial under Professor Morris. A quiet satisfaction came from him as he worked. Not pleasure exactly, considering this was child's play for him, but a deep contentment. Under his hand, the student essays, some of them awkward and lacking coordination, became as good as they had a right to be. Structure was a common problem which Morris solved by simply circling a paragraph and drawing an overlapping arrow stretching from one page to another. Grunting to himself, panting fumes, he touched up each essay, some less than others, always leaving style and substance intact. The basic story remained. All he added was shading for depth and focus. Willie knew when to quit. He folded a student paper, creased it down the middle, and said, 9 down, 3 more to go. I doubt he was aware that I marveled at how his editor's mind worked, how he tiptoed a fine line between polishing and revision, or that I felt deprived when there were no more essays for him to edit. His influence at the University of Mississippi from 1980 to 1990 can't be overstated. He dispensed advice in bars, bookstores, homes, football stadiums, anywhere a wannabe writer caught him with time on his hands. His canon, I would submit, can be multiplied 100-fold by the output of writers he encouraged. What he showed students over and over was not how to write, but how to edit themselves. And that the key is distancing oneself from his work. When my novel, Rommel and the Rebel, was published by Doubleday, I thank Willie for teaching me to edit myself, the last big hurdle for any writer. He shrugged and said something I'd heard him tell his students on more than one occasion. It was in you all along. Sooner or later, it had to come out. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
We do have questions. Let's see. The Yoknapatawpha Press published the first edition of Dinner at the Mansion. What was it like working with Elise Winter?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, Elise had a wonderful sensibility and understanding of Mississippi's history and its future, its promises, and that's all in her book, even though her book was about giving dinner at the mansion, dinner parties. And the people that she had and that she and William Winter entertained, it's a who's who of Mississippi. And it was wonderful to me to read that. It was a great education for me about what the governor's mansion could be. And I got Willie to write the introduction to it. Mm. And he was really enamored of Governor and Mrs. Winter. He actually lived close to them. And he and the governor went for walks together. So I'm glad she asked that question, whoever asked it.
Yeah. Could you say a few words about the role and the importance of William Ferris, Charles Reagan Wilson, and others in the founding of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture?
I was not part of that, of course, but I lived in Oxford and was a graduate of Ole Miss and a supporting alumni. And the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, Bill Ferris's godchild, was really a gift to Mississippi because it not only created new disciplines and established the needed study of folklore and the blues especially. And now there's a big blues collection at the University of Mississippi Archives. But it was a gateway for so many students. It gave them a chance. There was a lot going on at the center that was more than classes. There were lectures, and there were concerts, and there were parties. Don't leave that out. There's always a party in Mississippi. But Bill Ferris and Charles Reagan Wilson left us a great legacy there. Thank you to those guys. Thank you.
Tammy Yates has sort of a comment as much as a question. Were you relieved to get all this down at last? It's wonderful writer's lore.
You mean In Faulkner's Shadow? She's talking about In Faulkner's Shadow.
Talking about your memoir.
Yeah, it was a relief, and it took place over a pretty good period. Dean passed away in 2011, and the book wasn't published until this year, 9 years later. But I started writing it in 1973, a year after we got married. And I didn't write it as a memoir. I wrote it as a comic novel of our courtship and marriage. And those become the chapters in the early part where we had some, it was a rocky road to our marriage. And in fact, the name of my working title for the novel, which never got published, was Sea Rock City. But it was a relief, yes. And I had wonderful help from a writer in Maine. I would like to acknowledge Kathy Pelletier as one of my chief supporters, and she helped me cut. I had 450-page manuscript, And I knew I had to slim it down and get it on the subject, get it on the theme and not stray. And so some wonderful scenes in the Faulkner world there in Oxford have gone by the wayside. Maybe they'll come out as magazine articles later.
In addition to some of the high-profile authors that Yoknapatawpha Press was home to, there are also lesser knowns from some that you had mentioned: Edwin Yoder, James Autry, Starr Smith. How did y'all find those authors, and what was it like working with them on their books?
Well, Willie was a source for at least one book, Ed Yoder's book of essays, The Night of the Old South Ball. Ed was from North Carolina, and he was Willie's fellow classmate as a Rhodes Scholar in England. Jim Autry, I want to tell a little about James Autry. We published his poetry, 2 books, Nights Under a Tin Roof and Life After Mississippi. And Ed Meek suggested that Jim was looking for a publisher, and he said, why don't you talk to Larry and Dean Wells? And he came over, and one of the first things we discovered in talking to him was that his father, who was a circuit minister, had preached in Dean's grandfather's church. Now, her grandfather wasn't a minister, he was a farmer, but he was an elder in the Philadelphia Baptist Church outside of Oxford. And they had the Autrys, and when Jim was a little boy, he had eaten Sunday dinner. That was one way they paid the circuit riders. They fed them and their families really well. And they came to the Hale family. Her grandfather was named Sanford Hale. His wife was named Pearl Hale. And that was a wonderful coincidence. Now, it's funny, in Mississippi, it's like, where are you from? Who are your people? Right. Yes, now I have an idea of who you are and where you come from. Well, it's a cliche, but that helps. It really helped. It established a link between us and Jim, and the past has a mighty grip on us, and Dean really valued that. And of course, his poetry was wonderful, and so some of the manuscripts came in, and some were like Starr Smith's. You mentioned him, and others we developed in-house.
We have a question from an Ole Miss fan. Are there any stories about Billy Brewer from the Don Whitten book that you can tell?
Well, I'll tell one story. This is not really so much about Billy as it was about a party at Billy's house. Now, Billy Brewer was very convivial, and he loved Oxford, he loved Ole Miss. Of course, he had played there. And when he came back, we welcomed him with open arms, and he loved Willie. And he gave a party. Now, not too many football coaches do this. He gave a party after every game at his house, and people were fighting to get into that party. Well, we took Willie over there, and one night, Jimmy Buffett's parents, Pete's and J.D. Buffett, were in Oxford staying with us, and Ole Miss played Auburn, and you know, Jimmy went to Auburn his freshman year. He left Auburn after his freshman year, but he learned to play the guitar. Anyway, go Tigers, right? And so Pete's Buffett went over to, when she met Billy Brewer, Coach Brewer, he said, oh, Jimmy went to Auburn, and you know Auburn coach Pat Dye? And what had happened in the game was Auburn beat Ole Miss pretty handily, but at the end of the game, they were on Ole Miss's 1-yard line, and Pat Dye had the quarterback step back and kneel on every play for 4 downs until time ran out. And Billy said, tell Pat from me, I appreciate that. That was a great thing to do. Yeah. And Pete Slater said, well, I can't get through to Pat Dye. He doesn't give a party at his house after the games.
Question, are Faulkner studies still a vibrant field at the University of Mississippi so many years after his publishing career and his death.
Yeah, of course they are, under Jay Watson, and before him, Don Cartagena. The Faulkner Conference every summer is a wonderful occasion because it allows the scholars to come from not just the U.S. but all over the world, and they have 2 picnics at Roanoke, and they have a tour of the county. They have a tour of the Delta, which is really good, that my friend Tom Freeland started years ago. He's a blues historian, and it means so much to walk the terrain. I mean, here they are in Faulkner's world, right. And believe me, Yoknapatawpha is still there. It ain't going no place. And it's not just the landmarks, and the landmarks are there. And the tour shows people those landmarks. It's a sense of living on 2 levels at once. People in Oxford, believe me, I know this. I feel it, and I know that people that will agree with this, they can't help but live on 2 levels at the same time, fiction and reality. But they read Faulkner, and Faulkner overlaps reality. Faulkner's fiction, the stories keep telling themselves over and over in daily life. They keep happening over and over. The past is never dead. Yeah. And so Oxford is in a very wonderful place, and that it has that shrine, Roanoke, there, and it has the presence of Faulkner, which is never going to go away.
You had talked about Willie Morris, Barry Hannah. Could you talk a little bit about how different they were, how they interacted, and just sort of what the literary axis of the town was like when they were the 2 main stars?
Yeah, I remember when Hannah first came to Oxford, he was really interested in meeting the English department. Now this will show you what Barry was like at that time, okay? Willie was a spokesman for literature and for Mississippi. He had always been a spokesman for Mississippi, even when he was in New York at Harper's. And anything happened at Ole Miss, the writers sought Willie out. But Barry, the night we said, okay, we'll have the English department staff members over and their wives, and you can meet everybody and get to know them. So we started the buffet dinner for 30 people, which Dean had cooked, at about 7. And by 8:30, people were through eating and ready to go, and no Barry. Barry was at the Holiday Inn bar. I called the Holiday Inn bar on the suspicion he would be there. And Clyde Goolsby, the great bartender there, answered. And I said, is there a guy there in a leather jacket talking about flying Phantom jets in Vietnam? And he said, yeah, will you come get him? And so that was Barry's start in Oxford. And nobody stayed. When he got to the party, it's only Evans Harrington and James Webb and a couple of others had hung around, because it was a slap in the face to have a party specifically to meet them and then not come. But it just slipped his mind. And he was having fun talking about, he probably showed Clyde Goolsby his dog tags that he had bought at some pawn shop. Anyway, that was Barry. And Willie, on the other hand, I mean, he settled in at Ole Miss. He had been living in Bridgend for 10 years and had not had a regular schedule, and he missed that regular schedule, and he missed being in the center of things. At the Harpers, he ran New York City. He would go into the Four Seasons, and they would say, here, Mr. Morris, we've been keeping the table for you, just in case. He was on the Today Show 8 times, because, for one thing, if they had a guest cancel, they knew Willie would be up all night. They could bring him in at 4, and he would be awake and ready to talk. And he could talk about any subject. So that was the 2, Willie and Barry. Barry lived in his own world, and sort of in a bubble of creativity. He was always creating characters, and I know that he tried his characters out on us. He would start playing with a knife or bringing out his pistol, and he was thinking in terms of the short story he was working on at that moment. And and Willie was not a fiction writer. He was an essayist. He was a nonfiction writer, non-pareil. And so they came from two different paths, although Willie, as an editor, had his forte at Harper's. People said, "What was your secret at Harper's?" And he said, "I caught the writers between books, and I got fiction writers to write nonfiction." Like Styron and Mailer. Yeah. They hadn't done that before. It took New York, it took the country by storm. And Willie loved those fiction writers, even though he had to put up with all of their eccentricities. Actually, Willie was equipped with his own eccentricities. But Willie loved Barry and would forgive him anything. And Barry was kind of a competitive shadow boxer. He was like Hemingway. He wanted to knock the other writer out. Mm. And that was just in his nature. And we didn't blame him for it. And Willie didn't blame him for it. But it led to some hilarious scenes, which are in the book.
Yeah. I have a question about what are some memorable faux Faulkner entries?
Well, I'll start off with the last one that won it. And it was my friend David Sheffield, who, when he submitted it, we didn't know that he was the head comedy writer at Saturday Night Live. Okay? He wrote all of Eddie Murphy's movies. He wrote Coming to America. He wrote Nutty Professor. He decided he would imitate Faulkner when he was a contract writer at MGM in the 1940s. Here is Faulkner being asked to write a Three Stooges movie. He's writing a scene for the Three Stooges in which all the crazy, funny things happen to the Stooges, but it's all done in Faulknerian language. And it was stunning. And I loved it when David Sheffield read that, his winning entry on the stage of the Gertrude Ford Theater at Ole Miss. That's one of my favorites. There have been many other favorites. One of them was about Doomed, Damned Walmart, and it was about how Walmart came in and took over a town, and all the people hated it, but they worked there and they shopped there. But the Faux Faulkner contest would have made it, and it would be still going today if something hadn't happened. We chose as the winner, and I didn't choose it. I wasn't a judge. I gave it to the judges, so it was in the top three. A parody of George Bush, the President George Bush, as Benji the Idiot in The Sound and the Fury. I don't know if any of you remember this, but United Airlines refused to print it because Bush and Congress had just given the airlines, and especially United Airlines, billions in loans to make it through that 2008 crisis, recession, and 2006. And but it was so funny, we couldn't resist putting it in the top three because we knew that Pappy would like it.
What Mississippi writers, or I guess any writers, do you regret not having the chance to work with? Were there any projects planned that never got off the ground?
Well, there's one that's notable in my book, Barry Hanna's novel, The Tennis Handsome. Yeah. The Tennis Handsome started off as a magazine article for Barry, and then he had so much fun going on a tennis tour, I can't remember the name of the tennis pro, that the magazine article was soon cast aside. He hated writing nonfiction anyway, and he began to improve on life. His métier as a writer was to write fiction that was better than life, and because it was funnier and it was more accurately portrayed, as in his opinion. Anyway, he gave me The Tennis Handsome to edit for publication, and I edited it believing that we had shaken hands on a deal, and then he sent it to Knopf, and they published it. But I didn't blame Barry. Writers do what they have to survive, but it was great fun editing that. That was one of the treats of being there in Yoknapatawpha.
Thank you all for tuning in with us today. This has been great. Check our bookstore for copies of this wonderful new book, available at bookstores across the state. Tune in next week for Nancy Bristow when she talks with us about the 1970 shootings at Jackson State. Thank you so much for this program. Look
My
forward to more in
pleasure.
the future.
Thank you, Chris.